Head into your local Safeway for great spring savings throughout the store. This week at Safeway, get yellow peaches or nectarines for the member price of $1.88 per pound. Also this week at Safeway, value packs of Signature Farms chicken drumsticks, thighs, leg quarters, or picnic packs are buy one, get one free. Plus, get value packs of USDA choice boneless beef top sirloin steak for the member price of $4.99 per pound. Visit Safeway.com, download the Safeway for You app, or head in store to find more great deals at Safeway.
Ozcast.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Since 9/11, the United States of America suffered from what has been called mission creep. After the initial defeat of the Taliban and the displacement of their al-Qaeda allies in Afghanistan in December of 2001, in what many have claimed a very unique form of intervention, instead of claiming the victory and withdrawing, the Bush administration decided to stay in Afghanistan and attempt to change the very nature of governance in that country. Then, in 2003, before the Afghan project was anywhere near being complete, the Bush administration threw the weight of US military muscle against the dictatorship of Iraq's Saddam Hussein. While Hussein's forces were defeated and Hussein hanged for his crimes against the Iraqi people, Bush decided to alter Iraq's political trajectory as well. In neither the Afghan nor Iraqi cases did the US and their international coalition partners come out well. Indeed, kicking over the political trough in Kabul and Baghdad posed its own problems, which led to a series of very long and bloody military engagements in both Afghanistan and Iraq, seemingly without end. To discuss what Biden may or may not do regarding ending America's forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, joining us today is special guest Raspal Khosa. Raspal is an Adelaide-based independent defense analyst who has deep experience at the national level looking at the Afghan and Iraqi US-led interventions. Also joining me from our studio at Adelaide's grand old Epworth building is co-host David Olney. Hello, David.
Hello, John. Hello, listeners.
Unfortunately, Tim can't make it in today, but as usual, he is sending his paranormal vibes, which are being channeled through Andy, who has now pressed the button and of course, all the machinery here in the studio is working. Raspal, welcome to Strategicon.
Good afternoon, guys. Thanks for having me this afternoon.
Pleasure. Raspal, for simplicity's sake, the international media have truncated the stabilization campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq into the catch-all forever wars. But they are separate theatres of conflict with their own very complex dynamics. Is there a danger that seeing both campaigns in the same light, we run the risk of creating even more problems for ourselves?
Yes, look, the region is referred to as the Middle East region, even though Afghanistan is in Central Asia the last time I checked, or the sandpit, as it's also referred to, particularly by Western military forces that have served there. There are a great many dissimilarities, but where we find ourselves at this present juncture is similar to what happened in Iraq when the United States decided to precipitously withdraw forces under President Obama. President Biden, of course, was vice president then. And the Obama administration has suffered opprobrium with regards to that particular action. There was no status of forces agreement in place, and a very large US force was withdrawn at very short order. So Biden doesn't want to be tainted by something similar happening in Afghanistan. He hasn't been left with a great many options. US personnel are down to about 3,500, but for the first time in the campaign, there's actually fewer US personnel than NATO and partner state allied personnel within that Resolute support mission. It really is ebbing. The US forces withdrew under the agreement that was reached with the Taliban in Doha, and that was for all US personnel and by extension foreign military forces to have left the country by May of this year. the numbers went down to about 8,600 US personnel towards the end of 2020. And in a fit of pique, you could call it, Trump decided to pull out US forces down to about 2,500 boots on the ground. So that really limited the sort of options that Biden had. It's quite difficult to ramp up, and there's pressure on his administration. He has painted himself into a corner, if you like, by saying that he cannot envisage US troops still being in Afghanistan next year. He wants to go about it in a very responsible fashion, withdrawing these forces. There are now voices challenging any further drawdown from within the deep state, if you like. The New York Times, for example, reported an intelligence brief, a leaked intelligence brief that basically stated if you withdraw US forces, the whole thing is going to collapse, and you'll be faced with a situation of civil war. And what really is preventing the collapse of the Afghan military is some of those key enablers that are still in place, particularly US air power and drones, and more so bases from which you can launch operations at very short order from within Afghanistan.
So, Raspal, the US military's intervention in both Afghanistan and Iraq prevented al-Qaeda from staging another bold terrorist assault like 9/11 against the United States and its allies. So, narrowly defined, can the US claim victory at least against al-Qaeda?
Al-Qaeda operatives in along that Afghanistan-Pakistan border region have been keeping their heads down for a very long time now. They've been effectively treated to the extent that they do not pose a major challenge within the region to US forces. But the issue with Afghanistan and al-Qaeda is an interesting one. I mean, back in the 1990s, there were tens of thousands of Islamist fighters that were trained in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, al-Qaeda had access to the levers of state, and that was very important. The issuing of passports, even though only 3 states recognized Afghanistan under the Taliban as an entity, and that was Pakistan, which was a major player, the United Arab Emirates, and also Saudi Arabia, which is quite significant. So the Taliban has a very close ideological affiliation with Salafists from Saudi Arabia, from the Gulf, who were significant financial backers, but they were very simpatico with AQ. And al-Qaeda recognized Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, as the protector of the faithful. So that's very significant. And the jury is still out whether the Taliban have actually broken ties with al-Qaeda. But we move on. So Afghanistan is not the Afghanistan of the 1990s, and certainly the world isn't like that as well. But what has transpired is there are a great many other theatres for a group like al-Qaeda to reconstitute itself. We can see what happened in the Arab world. The failure of the Arab Spring gave rise to various groups that they morphed into organizations like the Islamic State. One must also bear in mind the Islamic State has a presence within Afghanistan. The Islamic State Khorasan province is based in eastern Afghanistan. But the Taliban views the Islamic State. It was a splinter of the Taliban anyway. It was disaffected Talibs who largely coalesced, and fighters came from other parts of South Asia as well to join it. They managed to carve out a bit of territory in eastern Afghanistan. In what's called the N2LK region, and they've been at significant odds with the Taliban. In fact, it was the Trump administration that hammered the Islamic State. The Islamic State was one of these organizations that actually posed a significant challenge to a lot of the key players in the region. I think it was something that everybody could see eye to eye on, the defeat of the Islamic State, because no one wanted to see that sort of instability affecting their region. And for that reason, the Taliban started to get backing for a number of reasons from the Iranians, to an extent from the Russians as well, and also the Chinese. So they're all significant players, and Pakistan certainly doesn't want the advent of an Islamic State type group within its national territory either. So I think it was Trump who dropped a Moab on the Islamic State, and they actually thought they'd been bombed with nuclear weapons. So, from the size of the cloud, the intelligence that was derived, saying they're hitting us with nukes. But no, there was significant operations being conducted against the Islamic State. But the issue is that the Taliban are at war, not to enter into some sort of joint governing arrangement with the Afghan government that it sees as as an imposition of the West. It wants to win. And I think they will say what they have to say. They will do what they have to do to continue to garner international backing. Afghanistan derives most of its funding from the international community. The World Bank governs the Reconstruction Trust Fund, and I think there's still $16 billion in there, and they want their hands on that to run various programs and all the rest of it. They've suffered, like a lot of developing states and Western states as well, from the COVID pandemic. It's had a significant impact on the economy. Afghanistan's an agricultural economy. In 2019, it was growing at between 3% and 4%. And it's taken a huge hit, probably 5%. So it's effectively in recession.
Can I just ask you?
Go ahead.
With regard to poppy production, for instance, Afghanistan's had a lot of international approbation because of its continuing poppy industry. Of course, this poppy industry is illicit, and some of it is also hived off to fund Islamist groups within Afghanistan. How does that also fit in within that structure, especially in the COVID environment that we're in? The economy, as you rightly pointed out, has taken a huge hit. Has that also had an effect on poppy production?
Look, I think the poppy production will become more significant in the light of COVID. I mean, COVID's impacted on the services sector. It also has had an impact on the agricultural sector. Afghanistan's gross domestic product is around $20 billion, give or take, and poppy production is a fairly significant element of that. It's at least $2 billion, probably more. Back in 2010, 2011, at the height of the US surge intervention into Afghanistan, I can remember having a briefing at ISAF Joint Command, and that's the operational level of command in Kabul. And they indicated that the poppy economy was worth about $400 million a year to the Taliban. That's how much they were deriving from taxes, from extortion, and basically forcing farmers to grow it, and hiving off money from the drug dealer guys. I mean, it was an interesting economy. Poppy production, the farmer is extended credit. He is given protection to grow his crop, and then he has it taken off his hands. He doesn't have to worry about the value add, having it in cold storage and all the rest of it. And the farm gate price was in the order of $200 a kilogram. It's a pretty labor intensive crop, so a lot of people were involved in its production. I mean, we talked about. We used to talk about fighting season in Afghanistan. Now, fighting season would commence when the weather got a bit better, so it was easier to move about. A lot of the Taliban leadership used to winter over the border in Pakistan, although towards the end they were staying there throughout the year. But look, it releases a lot of agricultural workers to pick up weapons. At the end of the poppy harvest, and that's around the April sort of period. So we're heading into fighting season now.
Yeah, the terrible combination of we'll pay you to grow the poppies, and then we'll pay you the $5 a day to spray rounds off or set a bomb.
Exactly. Yep.
It's a terrible combination. And you see, if we go back to the GDP and the state of the economy, we have the terrible situation that the reason poppies do so well is you can carry the product on your back.
Look, absolutely.
You can carry it. There is no infrastructure, and the only way they're going to get infrastructure is if someone invests long enough to extract the mineral wealth. And yet, who's going to be able to bring about enough security other than warlords to secure highways and train lines to move mineral wealth either towards Russia or China?
Look, I agree with you. I mean, the US Geological Survey actually released a report back a number of years ago now, once again, when they were involved in a big way, so circa sort of 2012 or thereabouts, 2011, 2012, that the economy was worth at least, the geology was worth at least $1 trillion, at least. And they were looking at old Russian data. And the Russians, of course, were only really interested in what they didn't have. I mean, they had plenty of hydrocarbons, so they didn't really need that, and various other minerals. But what Afghanistan does have is look, it's got a hell of a lot of copper, it's got gold, it's got iron ore, but it's got a lot of rare earths, and it's got a lot of lithium. Absolutely, it's got probably the second largest stocks of lithium after Bolivia. So it's a potential Saudi Arabia of the future. The Chinese are, of course, very interested, and they've actually bought the rights to a lot of these minerals. They bought a number of hydrocarbon basins as well. They also have got potentially one of the world's biggest copper mines in Gandhara, in the center of the Buddhist antiquities in Afghanistan. There's an iron ore mine which is being developed by a joint Indian and Canadian consortium. So look, there's a hell of a lot there if only the place was stable. The way the Afghans were going to address it was using their road security police. I can remember meeting with the Minister for Mining and Petroleum back in, it would have been around that 2011, 2012 sort of time frame. And he said he was fielding about 5 or 6 delegations a week of mining companies, not the really big players that were not prepared to work.
No, because they're not willing to work in that environment. So this is the irony of Eric Prince putting forward the proposal. Let me be the Viceroy of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Let me quite simply crush the place and make it safe for extraction.
There was a Viceroy of Afghanistan, certainly of southern Afghanistan.
This is why he was making the point that historically it's the only thing that works for a short period of time.
I was going to say A.W. Karzai, Hamid Karzai's brother, was the so-called Viceroy of the South, and everything had to run through him. It illustrates the fact that it was so hopelessly corrupt, and it continues to be. The way they used to secure the movement of convoys was to pay the Taliban. So
to go away.
We were inadvertently funding the insurgency to move, for example, a convoy of trucks once a week between Kandahar and Tarankot. I think it was about $2,000 a truck. That used to travel along Route Whale, one of the main routes, and Route Bear and that sort of thing. Basically, the local warlord guy, who was a Popelzai, part of the patronage network of Hamid Karzai, but it was Matiullah Khan. He was the head of the highway police, and then he had his own Kandak. In fact, it was bigger than a Kandak, a battalion. Western forces wanted to nominate it a brigade, but he didn't want that.
It was personal and recreational use only.
Exactly, and when Karzai was no longer president, a lot of these guys were removed. A.W. Karzai was shot in the head by a family retainer. Matiullah Khan was assassinated in Kabul. So it's very interesting how politics works in Afghanistan.
Raspal, what has been the cost of the US-led missions in Afghanistan and Iraq? I mean, do we have a figure? I mean, I know it's somewhere in the vicinity of, $3 trillion?
That's correct. That's correct, yeah. The $3 trillion is the figure that's bandied about.
How much of that money was actually for the development of an Afghan government, that sort of nation-building aspect, and how much of it do you think, in rough percentage terms, was on the military mission itself?
Look, I read that the US spent $1 trillion in Afghanistan.
Holy God!
That's the United States, but the United States is the senior coalition member.
Yeah.
There are other significant coalition members like Australia. We've spent millions and millions of dollars there. We provide funding to that reconstruction trust fund that I talked about earlier on. That's managed by the World Bank and managed very capably, I might add. We have also funded a lot of development partners. We run all sorts of programs, providing scholarships. I used to write reports for ASPI when I used to work there about how we can, move the reconstruction and development line of operation forward. We were in charge of the provincial reconstruction team of Afghanistan, of Uruzgan, right towards the end of our involvement there. We left around 2013, and so I was pushing, district stabilisation teams, recognising that it's an agrarian economy, recognising that we have to move away from poppy. They tried various things, including saffron, but nothing is going to compete with poppy.
Yeah, saffron could if people weren't funding to grow something else. It's the only thing sufficiently valuable to give you any second chance.
Yeah.
To put this in contrast, okay, we know that the Pakistani Taliban, that a lot of the Al-Qaeda guys who jumped across the border have probably disappeared into Pakistan, realised they're never going back to the Middle East, they're never going back to the rest of Central Asia. Afghanistan's chaotic. Pakistan, they can live in relative peace. Where does the Pakistani Taliban sit in all of this at the moment? Like, we haven't had a scary moment lately in the news of the Pakistani Taliban getting within kilometres of nuclear weapons, at least for a while. So things are a bit better? Or are we just not hearing about it?
Probably just not hearing about it.
Yeah, that's my guess, but I'm hoping.
I think there's elements of that. I think Afghanistan dropped out of the headlines for a long time. I mean, it's back in the headlines again because this date is fast approaching, this, the 1st of May date. Yes, Pakistan has had significant problems with insurgent violence in a number of its provinces. We tend to hear more about what goes on in Baluchistan, where the Chinese are
upset when their people get
kidnapped. Exactly. They're bankrolling the port of Gwadar. It's part of that Belt and Road initiative. It's a spur, but a significant one of that.
And will provide the spur to the spur for taking mineral wealth out of Afghanistan if they can get it to the border securely.
Exactly. Look, it's part of that. It's part of that great game that's taking place. Part of where Afghanistan is a theatre for proxy conflict between some of the key players, India and Pakistan. Some of the best roads in Afghanistan were built by the Indians. From various parts of Afghanistan towards Iran, where the Indians are bankrolling a port in Sistan, Baluchistan, the port of Chabahar. And that port, they argue, will give blue water access to the Central Asian republics. I mean, the Central Asia is very rich in hydrocarbons, in energy, whereas South Asia it's a deficit. So really, Afghanistan provides the passageway for a lot of this to flow. But you'll have to remind me that question that you posed before I sort of digressed there.
Oh, just what's going on with the Pakistan Taliban? Because we haven't heard much in the West for a while, and yet I'd assume they're in a rebuild and rethink mode, now realising they have to face a Pakistani government that are now more in bed with the Chinese than they had been in bed with the Americans.
Look, you're absolutely correct on all of that. The Pakistani Taliban were pushed over the border into Afghanistan, and the Pakistanis used to assail them from across the border and argue bitterly with the Afghan government that the Afghan security service was inadvertently funding the Pakistani Taliban to conduct operations over the border in Pakistan. The Pakistanis would literally shell them over the border and it'd be exchanges of fire with Afghan personnel as well. So they located themselves in the areas that were adjacent to those federally administered tribal areas, as they used to be known in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. It's a significant problem for the Pakistanis. The capacity for them to rise up is still there. They haven't been operationally significant in recent times, and the Pakistanis did actually conduct, when they eventually wanted to, some fairly significant counterinsurgency operations, particularly in North and South Waziristan. They, of course, had their own insurgents based there, groups like the Haqqani Network. in particular, probably the most capable, the most dangerous of all of the insurgent groups. I mean, they were basically supported and did the bidding of the Inter-Services Intelligence Organization. They were able to carry out very complex operations within Kabul itself. But then so does the Islamic State. I mean, they conduct operations particularly against groups like the Hazara, and to create discord within Afghanistan, to basically say that look, you cannot trust your government to provide you with security, even within the most within that sort of those concentric rings of steel, supposedly around Kabul.
In terms of lives lost, both the Afghanistan and Iraqi stabilization missions are still at the low end of the equation. However, in terms of people seriously injured from participating in these campaigns, this is not the case. Can you tell our audience roughly what the ratio is of coalition combatants killed versus those injured?
Oh, goodness, you're putting me on the spot there. There were 2,500 US personnel that died in Afghanistan, that were killed. There is an absolute multiple that were wounded. And part of the reason is that, in the modern battlefield, you can medically evacuate personnel and take them to very sophisticated trauma facilities. I'll give you Uruzgan as an example. There was a Role 2 hospital there, using that sort of NATO terminology. Now, a Role 2 hospital has got significant ability and surge ability. I mean, they can do heroic operations to save people's lives. And when they're stabilized, they can send them to Kandahar, to a Role, I think that was a Role 4. Where they can do neurosurgery, and then they can ship them out to Landstuhl, to a Role 5-6 facility, which will give you the best trauma care on the planet. There's no better to be had. And Australian personnel, that civilian and military, that were wounded were actually sent there.
Yep.
And their lives were saved, basically. So personnel that would have died in World War II or even the Vietnam War have survived, but suffering horrific injuries. And, of course, the big issue now is post-traumatic stress. Personnel suiciding. There's now a Royal Commission in Australia.
More dead from suicide than dead in combat.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So people continue to suffer, continue to die as a consequence of their service in Afghanistan. Then there's the whole issue of the burn pits. And I went to Afghanistan 5 times to forward operating bases, in areas such as Uruzgan, where a lot of the waste is just bulldozed into pits that are burning 24 hours a day. So wherever you go, there's a smell of acrid smoke, and God knows what it is.
What you're breathing in.
Exactly, and a lot of vets are claiming that this is causing them ongoing problems. So that's something that really needs to be investigated.
Sounds like the Gulf War syndrome, where we never really got, and I mean, people were using depleted uranium shells.
Yeah.
But of course, all the companies said, "Oh no, they're all safe." No,
it's also the case that we had the burn pits there too, but depleted uranium was a sexier target, and is more likely less significant than all the stuff that was burning. The interesting thing with the injury angle too, and it's still not really being picked up by many people, except professors at West Point like Nancy Sherman, that PTSD is one side of it, but the other side is moral injury. Yes. When you're involved in such a pointless war that no one can give you a clear reason why you were there or what you achieved.
Yes.
Moral injury plus PTSD plus, this is why trying to get real injury numbers for Afghanistan is almost impossible. Because if you just went and spent 2 days in the local hospital and then went back to unit and recovered with your team, you probably didn't end up on any formal paperwork that got counted as a permanent casualty. It was just something that happened at work and you recovered. It sort of fits in the OH&S category. Yeah. Now, war brings about a whole different kind of OH&S category.
Which leads to another thing, and that is that how bureaucratized was the way that we managed our campaigns? Because it sounds like it's Australian bureaucracy 101, right? Is it an occupational health and safety issue? Well, it's actually war. And that leads me to another thing, and that is that in what way did the wars themselves give a sense of holy crap to those people who were fighting for them? I mean, David noted quite clearly that with no clear definition of mission, it was always going to be a problem for people, especially when they get deployed, they come back home, they try to reintegrate in Civvy Street and in the civilian environment, and then just fail to do it because, there's a time lag difference as well. We can deploy people far faster than we did in World War One. World War One, you took a month by ship to go to the European theatre or the Middle East theatre. Now it's a short flight, and then all of a sudden you've got bullets and IEDs going off left, right, and centre. And then similarly when you're withdrawing from these areas, all of a sudden you're back in Civvy Street.
But there's a deeper issue here, and that is the professionalisation of the military. So the people who do this do not conceive of returning to normal life because they never had, from age 18 onwards, a normal life. They prepared for a military career that then disappears.
Absolutely. Look, I think we tackle it fairly well, John. I've been involved in this process, the mounting phase, the road to war. Army in particular, it's an iterative process, and they've certainly learned. I mean, one of my last jobs I did as a consultant to defence was to examine this process in the case of Iraq, looking at task group Taji 1 to 10, what worked, what didn't work, but really it was I guess an examination of adaptive army. And I think they've done it long enough in the forever wars to actually get fairly good at it. So they go through a period of battlefield inoculation. They've also got real-time communications with personnel that are in the field, and they do send recon teams over to actually see, what's going on. So I think we were pretty well set up there. In the case of, flying there, yes, I flew on those sustainment flights. You're at Sydney Airport drinking alcohol, and then you, are in a massive Western base. The first time I went there, it was Kuwait. And when you land, there's parks of US vehicles. I mean, it's just absolutely astonishing. From main battle tanks to mine-resisted armored, ambush-protected vehicles, MRAPs, absolutely. And just battalions of personnel arriving. And that's the gateway location either to go into Iraq or Afghanistan. You turn left or you turn right. And you spend a couple of weeks there where you've got to requalify with your weapons. Experience quite realistic training in terms of dealing with trauma. I mean, it sort of occurred to me that, this is serious. When they started handing out windlass tourniquets and combat dressings and all the rest of it, applying pressure and all this sort of stuff, and what happens if you've got multiple limbs blown off and all this sort of thing.
Yeah, but this is part of the deal now. If we don't know why we fight, then the golden hour better be real.
Yeah.
Because the last reason to do it properly is because the golden hour is taken seriously.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the golden hour. Like with most Western militaries, the furthest away you operate from your medevac facilities is within that golden hour. You've got, in Uruzgan, we had an entire US combat aviation unit. Which is practically more helicopters than we've got in the ADF. Absolutely astonishing. So there was always assets there to go and retrieve personnel. Even within the sort of thickest of firefights, so all of that was on hand. But at the same time, part of my engagement with the ADF was really to talk about the grand strategic part of the campaign. What's this all about? And is it sufficient to tell a digger that the reason he's deployed there is because of the US alliance? Bali happened a long time ago. That argument that we were there to restrict the space from which these insurgent groups could train and go off and conduct operations in the West. Now, it's a difficult thing with the Taliban because the Taliban weren't expansionist. Yes, they had that association with Al Qaeda, but part of it,
they were local.
Well, it was to gain funding through Al Qaeda, through Osama bin Laden, his own personal wealth. Yep. I think he had the largest number of shares within that. Some company that produced gum arabic, which is, fundamental when in the preparation or production of foods. So yes, there was a lot of coin there. Plus, they'd been fighting together against the Soviet occupation. Yep. And there's that whole sort of Pashtunwali code by which they lived. That they would support their allies to the last. And for a lot of reasons, they're not going to break with them. They might say that we're not going to host terrorists and all the rest of it, but I don't think they won't break fealty with AQ for that reason.
Share with me scriptures and help me to know it's easier to sink than to rise. The black and white bullets that fly from my mouth are hand-picked, tired old lines. And my shoes have worn through from this walking around. It's time to stand still and fight. Even the loudest of words will not make a sound compared to the sound of what's right. I saw a man on the news tonight crying for his child in the war. He looked at the camera and asked with his eyes, do we know what we're marching toward? In the halls and the courts, the dead kings cry out. Power is a slow turning wheel. Oh, it came around for us and it'll come around for you. It only gives what it can then steal. And the high-headed men that build the engine that runs are cold and dead in the ground. What they built when they lived, when they died was undone, except for what's holding us down. I saw a man on the news tonight crying for his child in the war. He looked at the camera and asked with his eyes, do we know what we're marching toward? Now choose to believe in that silver-tongued dream. Or try to rightly see that the strings you feel at the end of the day are the same strings pulling on me. And if the truth can be beaten and tied to a chair and made to say whatever we want, then the words that we serve are nothing but ours, and our God is not God after all. I saw a man on the news tonight crying for his child in the war. He looked at the camera and asked with his eyes, do we know what we're marching toward? Do we know what we're marching toward? Do we know what we're marching toward?
Neither the Afghan nor the Iraqi campaigns managed to whip up populist sentiment against them in the same way as people protested against the Vietnam War, for instance. So why do you think that that's so?
Can I disagree with that even before we start?
Yes.
Let's look back at the protests here in Adelaide.
Well, let's separate out Iraq and Afghanistan.
I want to say these two things are radically
Not in my name.
different.
Not in my name was the slogan with regards to the Iraq campaign. But look, you make a good point, John, and that sort of segues into the Joe Biden administration as well. Right. Afghanistan was always seen as the good war. It was pushed as the good war by a lot of politicians. Kevin Rudd,
Oh, yes.
Iraq bad war, Afghanistan good war. Right. President Obama, I almost said Osama then, please forgive me.
That can be edited.
I think that mistake has been made before. But look, Obama was all about leaving Iraq. The fact is that 4 U.S. administrations now with Biden have been preoccupied with the Afghanistan war. They've been involved there for a good 20 years. Biden always took the light footprint approach when it came to Afghanistan. I mean, he's been around.
We wanted counterterrorism plus.
Yeah.
When it was in the kind of McChrystal and that era of 2009-10, how are we going to proceed here?
Yeah. McChrystal was go wide. He was go wide. But prior to that, you had guys like McNeil and so on, Look, part of the reason was that they were really pressed for resources until they had that later Bush surge into Afghanistan, where Afghanistan, the insurgency came back to bite them in a big way around 2005-06. Look, the poor old Canadians and the Brits got absolutely hammered in Kandahar and Helmand, where they were trying to hold the line against an absolutely resurgent Taliban in southern and eastern Afghanistan as well. And it was actually Bush that started to put in those large numbers, and it was ramped up. With skepticism, I might argue. Obama never really believed a lot of the advice that he was getting from his generals. So it was really about putting dates on it. We will have a surge, but it'll go from now till this period. Yeah,
it was a lawyer managing war.
Yeah, and then
not understanding that you can't manage war that way. You either win or you don't win.
You can't. You talk this nonsense about conditions on the ground, but how can it be conditions on the ground when you say that transition to the Afghans taking the lead for security will happen by the end of 2013? By 2014, it would have morphed into something else, and then we'll have a resolute support follow-on mission because clearly the Afghans aren't up to it. Ultimately, it was all unsustainable. The Afghan security forces are taking enormous casualties. They're not sustainable. The recruitment and retention rates, they just cannot keep up with the attrition that's being suffered.
But that should work both ways, and that's the interesting problem. Because as much as the Afghan military was incompetent and is now on a good day moderately competent, they're still not highly competent.
There are parts of the military that are highly competent.
Yeah, but that can be said of any military. What we've got here is still high body count, and it should be on both sides. So how does one side sustain it when the other can't?
Absolutely. I mean, the Afghan military is highly dependent on its special forces, and the special forces are as good as any in that region. I mean, they're equipped by the Americans. They're trained according to a US Army Ranger template. I visited their Special Forces base back in, it would have been around 2011, 2012, and they use the same weapons.
They're also playing whack-a-mole.
I'll get to that point. You're absolutely correct. I mean, part of the big issue is that there's a stalemate in Afghanistan. You could argue that the Taliban have made enormous ground in the regions. Somewhere like Uruzgan, they're 5 out of 6 districts. They actually have sway. They hold sway over. They can't really take the biggest cities. They attempt to, and then they suffer fairly crippling casualties. When an AC-130 gunship gets up there, it's absolutely relentless. You don't want to get in the way. So that's the big problem. The Afghan security forces never developed the hold forces to actually be able to hold the districts, to be able to compete on the ground with the Taliban on a number of fronts. I mean, an insurgency is a violent competition in governance. They could never compete in terms of delivering justice to the local people. So the local people tended to trust them more. It was the special forces that kept growing and growing to the size of a division, and they were playing whack-a-mole. They were basically fighting fires, and they've been used extensively in places like Helmand to try and retake district headquarters, where main supply routes have been completely cut off. And, you now see the Taliban walking around with night vision goggles and M4s and so on, which they've taken from Afghan special forces.
Can I just say something here? Is this a particularly Western thing to do, to train up a government's special forces? Because we ourselves put so much emphasis on special forces. They're romanticized in Hollywood. They're, romanticized in literature. It's the special force commando that goes out and does all the killing. And all the other people who happen to be in uniform, they play kind of marginal roles. So we don't put that much emphasis on general ground troops per se.
John, I think you make some very good points there. I think part of the issue is that special forces were really optimized to train partner forces. So, US Green Berets, for example, we had our training team in Vietnam. They were elite personnel that worked with tribal peoples and that type of thing. But in Afghanistan, it was similar. You had US operational detachment A teams that were working with partner forces. As I mentioned to you, you had the Rangers that were training the Afghan special forces, the Afghan commandos and the Afghan Green Beret equivalents. And we had our SAS that were partnered with the Wakunish, that were the door-kicking element of the Afghan Secret Service. They were also partnered with the local warlord guy, the so-called Provincial Response Company, which were basically Matiullah Khan's men. Right. So, look, everyone wanted a piece of the action. It was all about guarding your terrain, as it were. No one wanted to relinquish. So special forces were used fairly extensively. Now, if you look at what's just been announced in the UK, for example, where a number of it's proposed that a number of rifle units come together to be used as a nimble brigade to actually go and take some of the pressure off the 22 SAS or the Royal Marine Commandos. Because
you have to start to hold the ground. And this is the thing. If you start trying to build a national military, you accept you're doing nation building.
Yeah. It used to be said that the US Army didn't do Windows. They didn't do Windows. They don't, not the computer application, but they didn't repair broken Windows. But in Afghanistan, they found themselves doing exactly that. And part of the issue was that you didn't get that civilian surge, that much vaunted civilian surge. It never happened. But what the US military did, and I think they did it fairly effectively, is that they used the National Guard. They use reserve forces in the roles that they actually work in their civilian lives. So you had guys who were meat inspectors, that they could go and help the Afghans develop capacity or build capacity. You had farmers that, could carry an M4 and defend themselves, but they could work with Afghan farmers. We didn't do that in the ADF.
But we've professionalised such a point. The other big problem too, and no one wants to talk about this in the US military, but the Green Berets initially wanted to do a traditional Green Beret mission, which was give us autonomy and we will get local people to the point of being able to defend their village and valley.
Yeah.
But that depends on autonomy, and in every case where they were given autonomy, Central Command took the autonomy away.
It happened in Afghanistan under Petraeus. Now, Petraeus is a very clever man, very, very clever man. I mean, he looked at Vietnam in terms of his doctoral studies. He looked at the ROFs and POFs and applied it to Afghanistan. So it was training up local forces. So you had an entity called the Afghan Local Police, and it went through a number of phases, a lot of it badly done, but towards the end, they actually got good at it. And that was, initially it was train up guys for 2 weeks, give them old Czech assault rifles that no one wanted. In fact, I saw a picture of a Talib carrying one today. I think it was the Washington Post or one of those. So they obviously found their way into the insurgency. Yeah. A lot of people just sold them at the local bazaars. So they weren't adequately trained or they weren't adequately supported. Now, the insurgency takes place at the grassroots, at that village level, where you are trying to affect the people for the government or for the insurgency. So the ones that were at the front line were these Afghan local police, and they weren't supported. Their villages could be overrun, and they're armed with fairly rudimentary weapons and not given a hell of a lot of training. But towards the end, they were being mentored by Green Berets.
This all started early with guys
ODAs.
Like Jim Gant and Ron Fry. And that was all removed. And when Jim Gant ends up being found in combat, pissed out of his mind and drugged up with his girlfriend in the firefight with him, that's really the end of the Green Berets being allowed off the leash. Yeah. From then they get moved to counter-terrorism. So what we can see here is we've moved towards centralised command, and you don't actually give elite troops autonomy.
Yes.
You can't partner properly with locals.
You can't, but it creates other problems as well. Now, when I was at ASPI, I worked for a Major General retired, and his famous quote was, special forces need adult supervision, and we saw things go terribly wrong with our own mission with Task Force 66, where you do, they're very decentralized the way they operate. You have sticks or sections, special forces groups that were basically under the command of a very experienced NCO. You don't have a lot of oversight of what goes on patrol. and atrocities were allegedly carried out. And this hasn't just impacted us. The Brits suffered this as well with 22 SAS. The US Green Berets were getting up to all sorts of things in central Afghanistan, not so far from Kabul.
No, but you watch, the further the war goes on, the less clear the reasons for being there.
Yeah.
The less clear that you can win, the less ability to embed and build some meaningful connection.
I agree.
Then it turns into whack-a-mole.
It does.
And trauma.
Well, can I just say something here? I mean, just listening to you gentlemen talk, it seems to me, and I hate to go back to what I was saying earlier, not enough emphasis was placed on the idea of developing a cohesive boots-on-the-ground approach. You can build your special forces up any which way you like. You can have them up to a division strong. It's still not enough to get into every nook and cranny of a country as complex as Afghanistan or in the Iraqi situation in Iraq. So you're going to have to actually go in with a plan to bolster ordinary...
Yeah, but no one wants that plan.
Well, no one wants that plan. Well, no politician wants that plan because it's not sexy enough.
John,
I mean,
they attempted to build a security force of 370,000 soldiers and police. It was not sustainable.
Yeah,
the attrition rate, the year-on-year sort of annualized attrition was around 24%. It was about 2% a month. You know, that was for the military, worse for police.
How much of that was actually because the local people that we're reputedly fighting for do not see the Western intervention in a legitimate...
Well, they don't see nation building. They see imperialism imposing a different nation than the one they want.
Right.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Even with the case, our personnel, I can remember attending one of these sessions in... was it Darwin or was it in Townsville? I can't even remember. But a colonel said, in the ADF, we're great builders. We will build a forward operating base and we might open the back door to the locals and they might volunteer information like there's an IED cache over there. But there wasn't a hell of a lot of engagement.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't allowed, and we didn't have the language skill. We didn't have the cultural knowledge.
Yeah. And I described the ADF personnel there. I said, you're like Starship Troopers. You've got this advanced, Western military sort of concept. You've got absolute state of the art equipments and access to technology, and you're going into, a medieval sort of civilization, almost feudal. Yep. And it is, we're worlds apart, and you couldn't get any more stark. I mean, it's a very cloistered society, the Pashtun society, certainly when it comes to the women.
Yep.
This is going to be one of these sort of red lines. When Western forces leave, Afghan women have made enormous ground.
And they're going to lose all of it.
Well, absolutely. So you're dealing with as I said, a Taliban regime that doesn't want to share power. They're not going to contest elections because that's been put forward by the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai, who's an enormously clever man. At the moment, he's in a power sharing arrangement with, Abdullah. And that only was bedded down fairly recently in terms of who has which ministries and who speaks to the Taliban and all this sort of stuff.
Well, typical kleptocracy and patronage.
Yes, absolutely. Look, it was all about, as I said, patronage networks earlier on. Afghanistan has dozens of ministries. You wouldn't believe it. And the reason why is because you have to reward. You have to reward your supporters with a ministry. Because within the ministry they have the capacity to to sluice off a lot of those trillions of dollars of Western money. But having said that, a lot of that money was sluiced off by contractors. A lot of that money didn't leave the United States because it went to United States development assistance partners.
Exactly.
Or some of those big companies like KBR and so on. When you went to the big military bases in Afghanistan, where you had your meals was
KFC.
run by some of these corporations. Yeah. Well, it's funny. We talked about General McChrystal. Now, McChrystal was a very monastic sort of individual. He kicked all of the fast food places off his base.
Right.
He used to run around the base. It was no alcohol either. It was absolutely dry. I think the only place you could get a drink was the the residence of the senior civilian representative, who was a Brit. So we used to go there and have a drink in the evenings on the various trips that I went on. But then, he wasn't responsible for the Italians in Herat. The Italians are the consummate hosts. When it comes, love going to war with them. They serve you pasta out of cheese wheels, and you have some wonderful northern Italian wine as well. If it's an Alpine brigade.
But here we get the irony of all of this. We've got a political elite that don't understand war, sending a professional military who need a war to justify the years of training.
Yes.
So they need to fight a war at the level they've been professionally trained to, which means super advanced whack-a-mole.
Yep.
When neither side have the ability to generate a political strategy that will have an impact. So, the quintessential comment you could apply to Iraq and Afghanistan is you break it, you buy it.
Yes. Well,
and yet if democracies had to take responsibility for the disasters they unleashed, that they made the disasters worse.
The term the Americans used was the pottery barn rule. You break it, you buy it.
Yeah.
Exactly. But look, I absolutely agree with you.
So where does this leave this notion of Biden wanting to withdraw remaining forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, considering the fact that those governments are so dependent on the Western forces that are there? Once those Western forces are no longer there, we've already said that at least at the Afghan level, but I'm pretty sure on the Iraqi level as well, local forces will not be able to keep the forces of darkness at bay. Right? Because there's an existential battle waiting to be fought for the heart and soul of both countries.
How about we all put a hypothesis forward and then vote between the three of us?
I think, look, I'm a lot more, once again, I think we need to separate out Iraq and Afghanistan. I think the situation in Iraq I'm much more enthusiastic about. I think, they've got quite a solid security force now. I mean, the issue with Iraq was always the political situation, where you had a situation where, in terms of the dispensation in Iraq, where the Shia were empowered. So was Iran.
Well, that's right.
But the Iraqis are Arab Shia. They're not Persian Shia,
right.
and that's the big difference. They're not going to take orders from
Tehran,
the Grand Ayatollah, or from Qom.
They've got a great potential for autonomy because they're odd. Yeah.
They've got a lot of oil wealth as well to pay for it. The issue is, can they achieve some sort of reconciliation within their country, within those communities? And it's really up to, to the Shia to reach out. I think the Syrians over the border will ultimately gain control of their entire country. I think with the Russians, they fought a very successful campaign.
The Grozny approach to war.
That's Idlib is that area, that still needs to be pacified. But the Russians are not going to relinquish their access to the Eastern Mediterranean.
No.
So for that reason, I think the space from which the insurgent groups operate in that region in Iraq and Syria is going to shrink. And ultimately, I mean, they tend to be quite authoritarian regimes that will seize control of their national territory. Libya, of course, is attracting a lot of these, and then the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa is where a lot of these groups have are very operational. In terms of Afghanistan. It's going to be very challenging. I think that the Taliban, and Taliban is not a monolithic entity. It's composed of hardliners and pragmatists. There are no moderate Taliban, not in the way that we see them. But they're going to have to give ground. They're going to have to achieve some sort of compromise, at least in the short term. What the American troop presence on the ground does give the Americans is leverage. And so does the mighty Greenback as well. So, yes, American troops on the ground did give them the capacity to get some Reapers and Predators up into the air, or a strike aircraft or a gunship or something like that, or even the mentoring sort of units of the Afghan military and directing them in an operational sort of way. It brought the ability to dictate to the Afghan government what the Americans wanted, and they can still do it, and they did. I mean, the Secretary for State, Blinken, did, issue a sort of a démarche, if you like, to the Afghan government, saying that, you will work towards some sort of, not a government of national unity, but develop some sort of construct where you can draw in the Taliban into the political mainstream. Now, Ghani has proposed having some sort of elections to elect some sort of transitional leadership. The Taliban is struggling to come to terms with that. They're saying that their senior political representative is Mullah Baradar, and he's saying no. The Doha agreement stands. The whole world saw it. We signed the bottom line, and that was that we will give ground and we will not attack your forces if you will leave by May. I think from a logistical point of view, it's not going to happen.
Of course not.
It's just absolutely unfeasible. The money has to keep flowing, of course. The Russians continued to fund the old socialist regime under Najibullah for a couple of years. Now, the Mujahideen couldn't take the cities. They famously tried to take Jalalabad, and they were defeated. It was only when the dollars or the rubles
ran out,
dried up, that people started to take their uniforms off. And that's when the warlords basically carved out their fiefdoms. Rashid Dostum, for example. I mean, a lot of these guys were senior commanders of the old...
they just freelanced once there wasn't a cash flow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the situation will probably be similar in Afghanistan.
But that seems the critical thing this time is the Russians had done the geological mapping on some of it.
Yep.
The Americans have finished that. And the Chinese are looking hungry.
Yes.
So this could well end up being a decision nothing to do with the future of Afghanistan and everything to do with the great game of mineral control.
You are absolutely correct.
And that seems the most likely move forward to me.
One of the big platforms that the Biden administration is going to adopt is a very intense diplomatic approach to get everybody on the same page. And it's going to be difficult because the relationship with China is obviously at a nadir. With Russia, it ain't good. When you have Biden referring to Putin as a killer and a thug and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But you need to get these states on board. And, with the Iranians, I think the situation will be better than it was with Trump.
Well, I was going to say about that because, if the coalition withdraws from both Iraq and Afghanistan, say within the next 2 years, let's be optimistic,
yes.
right? Those withdrawals obviously will advantage Iran strategically, especially now that Iran has hitched its wagon to the Chinese gravy train with $400 billion.
Year agreement.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, this now is manna from heaven. It gives the party bosses in Beijing an idea that they can realize their One Belt, One Road vision, right? Because they've got Iran.
I think you're absolutely correct. And I think, the Iranians were fairly close to the Indians. And now, with the Quad, we see, some tectonic movements taking place.
The world is dividing up very quickly.
It's coalescing. And with the Indians, I think it is problematic because they actually get a lot of energy from Iran.
Exactly.
They haven't got fantastic reach into the Gulf, and a lot of other providers it's sewn up. I mean, with Australia, for example, and the sale of gas, those contracts are well and truly sort of signed and sealed decades into the future.
Yep.
And India's years behind, and so it's interesting the developments that are taking place, and how it's going to play out. I think it was Kissinger that basically said that Afghanistan really needs some sort of grand bargain, similar to Belgium, where the neutrality is observed there by a lot of these vested interests that have all got skin in the game. I think with regards to the Indians, they were strong backers of the Afghan government. I think they're going to be major losers in all of this.
Wow.
They were one of the biggest providers of assistance, or assistance in kind, the development of those roads that I talked about. The Indian Border Roads Organisation had people on the ground, and they actually had military on the ground protecting them. The Indian Tibetan Border Police commandos, there were hundreds of them protecting the Indian road workers.
Can I just pause here? Does this mean, I know we're talking about a very complex thing, but I'm trying to sort of distill it down to its basics. So if India loses, does Pakistan gain?
I think Pakistan is very closely tied to China, obviously, as a strategic, as an ally, basically.
It is an ally
since the 1960s. And all-weather, ally, as they used to call themselves. But certainly that they will benefit, and with the Belt and Road Initiative, they've invested heavily in that in terms of capital, political capital. There's the whole issue of the debt entrapment. And the Pakistanis potentially losing access to to key resources if they don't as happened in Sri Lanka, the loss of the Hambantota port.
Exactly.
I mean, so that could be a big issue for the Pakistanis. But the Pakistanis can look at what's taking place with the Quad development and just the sort of nexus between Delhi and Washington now, whereas they used to try and have some sort of relationship with the United States. It became problematic when Trump tweeted, I think his first tweet of, 2019, that, these guys have been taking us for a ride.
Yeah, that's right.
And all the rest of it. Decided to cut them off at the knees.
But it should be very interesting for Pakistan and Iran to both have to go, we have to play nice.
Yes.
Because we both desperately need China. And stuck between her is Afghanistan. And we both can probably dabble, but can't destabilise, but otherwise we'll upset, the people that run trade.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting situation that you end up with India having to be part of the Quad because it has no friends in its neighbourhood.
Yes, look, I think you're absolutely right. I think, it is that sort of preponderant rump of the old British Raj, the great, it's really unfortunate for Pakistan and Afghanistan that Pakistan doesn't have any sort of relationship with India or the sort that it should, because all of the lines of communication
all lean that way.
They were truncated because of international borders and all the rest of it being put in place. But Afghanistan, in terms of what it produces, its best market is India, and there is a sort of a through trade agreement with Pakistan, but trade can't flow in the other direction. And when it gets to the border at Wagah in the Punjab, the trucks have to be offloaded by human beings. I mean, it's a preposterous set of circumstances that prevails there. But really, I mean, we were talking about the funding and development of agricultural infrastructure. I spent a day with a Canadian colonel, a hard-bitten infantry colonel, who subsequently became the defence advisor to Australia for the Canadian High Commission. But he was trying to get Indian businessmen to invest in Kandahar to build juice plants and various other infrastructure. I mean, some of the best produce in the region is from Afghanistan. It can potentially be a breadbasket. It produces enough wheat to produce a surplus, more than enough to feed itself. It produces the best pomegranates you'll find anywhere. These wonderful organically grown air-dried grapes. And this Canadian colonel told me, he said his old dad told him, back in the 1930s and 40s, you used to get sultanas from Kandahar.
Wow.
In Canada, in the prairies in Canada. So why can't that happen now?
Yeah.
It's incredible. But there you were. But I got the feeling he was hopelessly out of his depth.
He could see he wanted to do something, but just no training to do it.
Absolutely.
And no resources to start.
And the coalition was not getting that sort of civilian support. And a lot of the, the development assistance was from carpetbaggers. You had mercenaries, the private security contractors who were making a lot of money. And, I can remember flying out of Afghanistan with a bunch of these guys. And I thought, this must have been like the 30 Years' War, where you had these war bands, these mercenaries that basically, made their living from moving from, one city-state to another.
To pick it clean and then move on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, so it was companies like the private military firms and so on, development assistance partners that made a lot of money. That's where a lot of those trillions of dollars of treasure, of taxpayers' money went.
Which, again, is a way to make it look like we've found an economically viable way to spend so much. Look, a lot of the money came home. We put it in the country, and it came home in the pockets of people from our country, and the country we're fighting in. Again, the pottery barn got trashed.
Yes.
It's a very neoliberal way of looking at war, isn't it?
Well, it is, because it was a very neoliberal war.
It was. I mean, when you had people like Dick Cheney, who was the vice president of
the country and Halliburton.
Well, and then you found, a lot of companies like Halliburton, KBR, present on the ground, providing, logistic support in all manner of ways.
Assuming that Biden can successfully wind up the wars the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, how do you think history is going to judge the Bush administration?
Goodness me, that's a big question.
That's the final question, so take your time.
We'll just play some mood music because this could take a while. Yeah. And that's no insult on our guest. It's a statement of the size of the question.
Absolutely. Look, the Bush administration hijacked by a bunch of neocons, effectively. Did they need to go so wide in terms of their interventions? I think even prior to September 11, interventions were the order of the day. I mean, they really kicked off under Clinton. If you look at the
but only until Black Hawk Down. Then it got scary.
Well, exactly. And we were there in Somalia as well. We were in Baidoa. It was one RAR that was commanded by the President Governor General.
And having talked to Australians who went out with the relief column on that night, watching Mog burn, there was big lessons there. But unfortunately, everyone was there, was too junior and never became that senior or a diplomat. Yeah, look, I agree with you. So I think history will judge it, rightly and fairly, and I think they stand condemned. And certainly in the case of Afghanistan, the withdrawal of key resources when a military presence could have made a difference. Yeah, early enough on. Absolutely. With a chance to win.
If there was a battalion to block fleeing Al-Qaeda fighters, including Osama bin Laden, from the Tora Bora location into Pakistan, into the federally administered tribal areas. Now, that could have made a difference. Yep. So, I think a lot of opportunities were squandered, but at the same time, there was among the international community, there was a certain hubris. They didn't invite the Taliban to the Bonn conference. Now, there should probably be another Bonn-type conference where the Taliban are sitting at the table. They were a feature of the political landscape. They are they represent in many ways the Pashtun community, particularly those deeply conservative rural Pashtuns,
which is the majority of the country.
It's a lot of the country, absolutely, and so the issue was where you might have had Pashtun figureheads such as Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani, they were seen nothing other than Western puppets. As purely figureheads of what was a government, certainly early on, that was dominated by Tajiks, by the old Northern Alliance, and and people like Dostum that who will basically turn to see or the force that's got the upper hand, and sort of throw in his lot with them. It was always very, very problematic.
Well, I think, gentlemen, that's a wrap for today. Raspal, Khosa, thanks for joining us on Strategicon.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you for having me. Great conversation.
Thank you. My thanks also to co-host David Olney and to our vacant producer, but thankfully Andy stepped in, so we're okay there. And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategicon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video through Strategicon Raw YouTube channel when they are available, and they're easily accessed by clicking on our link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. If you would like to support Strategicon, remember to check out our merch page. We have a wide variety of items to keep the Strategicon listeners satisfied. Until next time, goodbye.
Ozcast.
Head into your local Safeway for great spring savings throughout the store. This week at Safeway, get yellow peaches or nectarines for the member price of $1.88 per pound. Also this week at Safeway, value packs of Signature Farms chicken drumsticks, thighs, leg quarters, or picnic packs are buy one, get one free. Plus, get value packs of USDA Choice Boneless Beef Top Sirloin Steak for the member price of $4.99 per pound. Visit Safeway.com, download the Safeway for You app, or head in store to find more great deals at Safeway.